I love me some Stephen Jay Gould and all, but the idea that we're going to solve the conflicts between religion and science the way that two hostile roommates in an 80s sitcom would divide up the apartment is, at the very least, a bit naive. And yet, for decades, we've labored under the weight of this nonsensical concept of Noma, or non-overlapping Magisteria. Now, even if you're not familiar with the terminology, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept, right? Science has its realm over here that deals with the material world, and religion has its realm over here that deals with the spiritual world, and never the twain shall meet, so no need for conflict. Now, if all you're hoping to do with this thing is pat some Christians on the head and make them feel like the kids' table is way more awesome than the grown-up table, maybe there's some value to this. I mean, after all, in a sense, it's true, right? I mean, science and religion explore non-overlapping magisteria in the same way that science and Harry Potter fan fiction do, right? One deals with stuff that happens in the real world, and the other is purely imaginary. And if a bunch of Harry Potter fan fiction writers started asserting that Hogwarts was a real place and flu powder was a legitimate means of locomotion, we would have to smack them down with a Noma-like argument. But in order for it to be effective, we have to point out that the reason the two magisteria never overlap is because one of them is complete bullshit. And of course, in the Gouldian compromise, we're trying to avoid pointing that out, which renders it worse than useless. That makes it a liability. It legitimizes their magisteria. Now, of course, I'm hardly the first atheist to take issue with this argument. It's been pointed out plenty that if it was true, Gould never would have had to propose it. After all, we don't waste our time developing vaccines for cooties or the Mondays. Gould was responding to conflicts that were clearly visible between these two fields and politely asking religion to go back to their department so that science could worry about all the biology and shit. And as I'm sure you noticed, they didn't. No, others have pointed out, of course, that at best religion treats this like it's a one-way street. They love to invoke their safe space whenever science challenges one of their sacred beliefs, but not so much when it's time to research stem cells or teach kids about evolution. So the extent to which theology will accept this concept is always going to line up exactly with the extent to which science is willing to voluntarily hamstring itself. Still worse is the fact that the very methods that theology use are still subject to scientific inquiry. I mean, if you're looking for answers in the Bible, and archaeologists prove that camels weren't domesticated until long after domesticated camels show up in the Bible, science just took a huge steaming shit right in the middle of your magisterium. If your discipline relies on attributing certain ecstatic mental states to a divine source, and then science recreates those same mental states using electromagnetism, science just whittled down your magisterium a little more, didn't it? And if one discipline can reduce the scope of the other, you can't honestly argue that the two don't overlap, can you? But perhaps most damning of all, the concept contradicts the very nature of science. Unless you reduce religious claims to deism, the two magisteria must overlap. If God answers prayers, that can be tested by science. If God has a son, that can be tested by science. If the cracker turns into divine dead guy, that can be tested by science. There is no way to have a consequential God without consequences, and science can test the consequences. And when you think about it, all of these objections are really just subheadings to the primary issue with Noma, which is the fact that it grants religion a magisteria in the first place. In practice, what we're saying is, when careful observation, peer review, meticulous testing, and data-driven analysis fails, it's time to turn to the men in chess piece costumes that interrogate all of their information out of a magical ghost Jew. I mean, do we want to leave any questions in the hand of a discipline that has no methodology? And if we're going to, would we want to do it with vitally important shit like ethics? I mean, look, I'll freely admit that there are plenty of questions that science can't answer now and never will, but that's because those questions don't have answers. They're not good questions, but that's not where theology's planted its flag. Instead, they go to the very threshold of human understanding, imagine their way 4 steps further, and stake their claim on that. Why is there something instead of nothing? How did the first living thing come into being? What happened before the bang? And sure, science can't answer any of those questions now, but if you think science can never answer those questions, I'd invite you to revisit the perpetually receding list of historical shit that scientists were sure that science would never figure out in the past. It could very well be that some future Einstein will figure out a way to definitively prove that time began with the Big Bang, and any theological claims about what happened before that are going to be wiped away with a single equation. I mean, look, the more we learn, the more clear it becomes that science may one day find a true cure for mortality. And if and when they do, I certainly hope that nobody in the scientific realm decides that they should shelf that cure since immortality isn't really in their magisteria. See, ultimately, that's the biggest problem with the Noma olive branch. It's disingenuous. Even if religion accepted it, the end result would be science herding them into ever smaller reservations as their previously unanswerable questions fell victim to the relentless crusade of curiosity. We would constantly be at their borders, ask them to move back a couple hundred more paces while we filled in the latest unknown nugget that they had elected to cling to. Because despite Gould's conciliatory language, the real difference between the questions that science asks and the questions that theology asks is that the former get answered. And if we allow the light of science to shine bright enough, there will be nowhere left for God to hide.